I'm John Tito, Whitetail Landscapes. This is Maximize Your Hunt. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully everybody's doing well. I have been super busy. I'm actually on the road tomorrow. I'm on the road the following week. I'm gone for an entire week. And then I'm back. I got a week off. I've got more clients coming up, and then I'm done end of September. It's been a busy year for me. This has been the busiest year that I've had. So I appreciate everybody, considering me. And it's nice being able to do this as a professional career. I enjoy it. I love working in the Northeast. Next year, I'm traveling all over the country, which anybody in New York wants to have me on their property. I would really, really appreciate that. I don't mind traveling, but I like staying close to home. And I'm certain everyone who listens to this recognizes I have children, and it's critical to just me being around my house. A couple things I've been working on. Got a bunch of cameras out. I run about 55 trail cameras a year. It's a lot of information for me to process. In fact, and I'll just admittedly talk about this, I've been going through the process of analyzing those cameras now from last year, and it's actually a great time. It reminds me of some of the deer that I've been after, some of the deer that potentially have made it through the season, and I'm trying to re-engage. One of my bucks that I was focused on last year was a 2.5-year-old. My son had found the shed for it. He's alive, and he's a stellar 3-year-old from my area. Probably 120 inches, but that's a really good buck in my area. And hopefully the other big one shows back up, and that will be a target deer for my son. We're going to try to put him on the more mature deer that I passed up a bunch of times last year. So, that's just hopeful activities going on here. And I'm excited. I've been working a lot on client projects, and I've really got to dial in here, because I hate working on client projects during hunting season. I like to take a couple months off, enjoy myself, and then I start right back up in December. So just so everyone knows what my current status of life is, that's where I'm at. All right, so we've got Andrew Little. He's not been on the podcast, and we've had some other folks that he's familiar with, Marcus Lashley. We've had a few people on this podcast that he knows and interacts with. And so we wanted to bring him on the podcast today. He's actually a Pennsylvania boy. He's out in another state now, but he's going to share with us, we're going to try to do some things that you can think about during the hunting season, and more specifically, a rapid habitat assessment. We'll talk maybe about ag-dominated versus forest-dominated, and I have some other questions I think are relevant that I'd like his input in, and just to give the audience some information. So let me bring him on the show. Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself, John?
Good. I'm just relaxing. My daughter's in the other room right now, so I'm just hoping she doesn't run in here and start yelling.
I know in the early days with COVID, I had a lot of those instances with my kiddos running in, so I totally understand that. So
let's get some background on you. I mentioned you're a Pennsylvania boy. Let's talk a little bit about your background, where you're working now, and then let's get right into the topic. We like to run fast on these.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm originally from South Central Pennsylvania, near Gettysburg area. That's where I grew up, and had a passion for hunting and fishing as a kid, growing up in a pretty rural area there. And then that eventually led me to get my bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife at Penn State University. And then I took off and went further south, went to Mississippi State, worked with MSU Deer Lab and Steve Damaris down there. Doing my master's work, we looked at the effects of hunting pressure on mature buck movements and habitat selection out in the state of Oklahoma. And then after that, I eventually made my way over to the University of Georgia and did my PhD working with Mike Chamberlain. Many people in the turkey realm are real familiar with Mike. I did my PhD looking at wild turkey habitat selection, nesting ecology, etc., in a longleaf pine system in South Georgia. And then today, after that, wrapped up my PhD, I made my way up to University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm an assistant professor here of landscape and habitat management. My position is kind of unique in that I'm 60% extension, 40% research. And what that means is I'm out there interacting with landowners, working with conservation professionals, et cetera. And particularly our lab is really our awesome lab. It's my hat here, AWSM. We focus a lot on conservation and ag landscapes because Nebraska is obviously very ag dominated, and we could probably chat about some of those things here. But yeah, that's kind of the whirlwind kind of upbringing to where I'm at. But again, passionate deer hunter. It's similar to you. I was just thinking about stands and stuff like that today and some of my sites and putting more cameras out and getting all that stuff ready to roll. So, because our season starts here within a couple of days or so with archery season. So,
Yeah, you're early out there, and that's
Sure.
it just makes your summer just feel so condensed, right?
It does. It does. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I saw some folks are out doing archery pronghorn hunting the other day and already posting pictures up already of their harvest. It's like, wow, I can't believe summer flew by incredibly fast and we're, approaching fall really fast. So time to get out in the deer woods. So,
Yeah, so I think if people are sitting in the tree stand or they're getting prepared, they're on the road, whatever they're doing this time of year, it's a good opportunity to kind of talk about what our landscapes offer us. And I think a lot of times we miss out and we don't dialogue enough about this. And, a lot of people get confused with understanding vegetative quality, species richness, evenness across the landscape, spatial distribution, patchwork. There's all this verbiage that's out there. And what I say is diversity is critical. But really defining that a little bit more importantly, particularly in maybe areas that are wide open landscapes or areas that are very forested. So I want you to start with maybe forested areas. And let's start going maybe through the process of habitat assessment. How are we going to look at the landscape and dialogue a little bit more about goods, bads, betters? What can we do here? Some of the practices, but let's kind of like, how do we assess our landscape?
yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things I always talk with folks about is kind of start with getting like an aerial photograph of your property, including your neighbors, and kind of see that landscape as a whole. And that's one of the things I talk a lot about with people is landscape management and what does that mean. And so I always say kind of thinking beyond your property boundary. Obviously, it's critical to think about your property as a whole, but also think about think about the neighbors' properties as well and kind of what they offer in that landscape. And so, for example, you mentioned with forested landscapes, say your property is predominantly forested and then your neighbors are maybe more ag, or more, they have some open fields and things like that. Thinking about how deer, for example, are going to interact with that landscape. They may be using your property for maybe in the, kind of fall, winter times, and then maybe during the spring into the summer, you see them moving more out into those agricultural areas or more open areas. Because deer are, as you know, John, are an edge species, so they love being around edge. And so you really kind of hit the nail on the head there. Heterogeneity in that landscape is key. So when we typically have monocultures of things, and I use forested systems as an example. When I was in at Penn State, actually, I think it was right after I graduated, I worked with Dr. Dwayne Diefenbach, also a very famous deer researcher out of Penn State. And we did a rapid habitat assessment and as a part of the project we were doing with Pennsylvania Game Commission. And with that project, it was really to kind of assess, quickly, what are the conditions of these landscapes? And so when we're especially in the northern part of Pennsylvania, very dominant forested areas, mountainous areas, there's not a ton of open areas in there. And so one of the things we would hear from hunters, we would regularly is, well, I don't see deer like I did before, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. Well, what's going on in those areas? Well, what you see is succession of trees. So what that means essentially is these plants are these trees, for example, are getting older over time. Plants success. They can go from one stage to another. And so they went from saplings at one point in time to now they're, mature forests. And so what happens, obviously, is when you get those big mature forested blocks and you have no other like open areas, obviously those canopies then begin shading out that understory. And then what happens is you can see 200-300 yards to the woods, and you can say, well, I don't see a deer. Well, part of it is a deer doesn't necessarily feel very safe in those really, closed canopy areas. They want to have areas where they have some obstruction in there. And so essentially that's where, I know you guys do this, but thinking about ways to help landowners, identify forest management practices and create openings, for example, doing things like selective timber harvest or, doing hack and swerve methods and things like that. And we can go into more detail on those. But the point is you're trying to create that heterogeneity. And so I think that's really a key thing, kind of looking at your property to start and saying, okay, well, what does my property offer deer? And then that's part of that aerial map is then you can say, what about my neighbors as well? What are the things? Because the thing about deer is unless you're managing 1,000+ acres, which I know many people are not, they're more in the kind of scale, maybe 50 to 100, maybe a couple hundred acres. Well, those deer are going to move off onto neighbors' properties. That's just the reality. And so thinking about how you can manage maybe in collaboration with your neighbor too, that's another conversation. ways you can kind of the strengths and weaknesses of different properties, and how do you create these properties in a way that's going to benefit kind of that local deer population. So
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's a good introduction to this. And there's two things that come to mind right off the bat. We're talking about describing the habitat, looking at a macro scale, then
Yep.
comparatively comparing your property versus your neighbors, and then more importantly, evaluating the value or quality of your particular habitat as it currently stands,
Sure.
and then addressing weak areas or limitations, something along those lines.
Sure.
So if we get into some of the specifics, and you talk about, deer having preferences to edges and
Sure.
diversity indices, basically along these different margins of change and this patchwork setting. If you were to say, okay, I'm going to do a rapid habitat assessment on property, and that's what I'm doing tomorrow,
Sure.
what would be the methodology you would say? Do I value something higher than something else because I'm in a forested setting, or maybe I'm in an ag dominated setting, and therefore I'm going to value maybe trees or agroforestry or some type of practice, natural, progression or succession with plants in an area? Like, how do you dialogue about this intelligently so people can start making
Sure.
some suggestions and understanding what's good or what's not?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point, great question. So, kind of thinking about back to the conversation of looking at your property, like what are the limiting factors? So, what are those limiting factors that, for example, in a woodland or forested system, do you have enough openings to provide that early successional vegetation for deer? Do you have enough diversity of your, say, mass-producing oak trees? You have shrubs out there. Or you have areas where you have bedding cover? So do you have areas that are thicker, brushier areas? Or is your property just like a kind of you're walking in, an open park? Because if that's the case, then one of the main limiting factors would be, hey, I don't have much in the way of bedding cover on my property. Well, how do I do that? Well, that's where you can come in and do timber management practices to start opening up that canopy and getting sunlight to that forest floor. If you're obviously in like a more of a cropland area, do you have enough, hard mass trees around? Do you have some forested areas near you? Or is it just a totally, kind of open area? Obviously, you get into some of the further western states of the United States, and that's kind of the landscape that those deer are used to living in, is pretty open areas. But, thinking about areas that are kind of, you have a mix of, and out here in Nebraska, we do have that, as we have places that are a mix of kind of cropland and forested land. And that's where deer are really thriving in those landscapes, because it's also looking at, do I have enough trees, do I have enough shrubs, to kind of provide some visual obstruction for those deer? And one thing I would say is to folks is to start simple. We kind of talk about like this local kind of on your property, to maybe kind of talk about your neighbors and kind of think of strengths and weaknesses. I just always say start somewhere and kind of start simple. Don't feel like overwhelmed, because I think that's possible. You can get overwhelmed, like, oh, I got to do like 10 different things. But I think one of the things, and if people are familiar, Aldo Leopold, who's the father of modern wildlife management, he wrote a book called the Sand County Almanac, and he wrote a couple other ones for the health of the land. There's another book that I've been reading. And in that book, he talks about back in the 1930 time period of just of a lot of the same challenges we're dealing with today with conservation and finding ways to implement conservation strategically on the landscape. And the point I mentioned that is he actually has a chapter in the Sand County Almanac. He talks about the land ethic. And that land ethic is, that kind of that unrolling or kind of unfolding of your relationship with that land, learning your property, learning the things that are the strengths, learning the things that are the weaknesses, and then working with either consultants or private lands biologists, et cetera, to help identify ways to, address those areas of weakness on your property. To again, try to optimize it the best you can. So to your question, a little bit more detail. With the assessment side of things, I think you just kind of start identifying some of those big questions. Do I have areas that are, have a mix of oak trees on my property? Say we're in a forested setting. Do I have areas that are maybe have a lot of maple or elm or other things that are maybe less desirable? that maybe if that's the case, that's kind of maybe a poor quality, forest condition. So therefore, we need to do some practices to try to mitigate that encroachment into the upland areas. So I could go into more detail if you want, John, but I figure maybe we'll kind of keep talking through some of this, because I think it is really good to have some of these discussions and find ways to make this helpful and real for the landowners. They don't feel overwhelmed by all the information.
Well, you brought up a topic I think is pretty important, and you said bedding. Bedding areas are critical, or areas of construction around cover. Sure. And so ways to measure cover or ways to assess at the habitat level, put a prescription to create this ideal cover, suitability for deer.
Sure.
Deer are quite adaptable, right? If
Sure.
you have a field setting and then you throw some trees in there and there's no trees elsewhere, they might end up at that location.
Sure. Yeah.
So maybe there's a way to address maybe how to create suitable bedding cover. Maybe a prescription on that. When I work with clients, I have a tendency to be very descriptive based on the localized area. What's the volume of hunting pressure? What's the attitude of these deer? The social interaction and herd dynamics is critical, and the hunting pressure and the relative environment that they're in is critical to how vigilant they are in a particular area or how they interact. With these certain species of plants. You started bringing up trees and assessing maybe the ecological benefit of those trees as it relates to deer. For example, you brought up oaks, right? Producing acorns.
Yep. Yeah.
The frequency of that may be an important aspect of creating areas of interest and cover or regenerating those oaks, because red oak in my area is a preferred food source. And that's why you're not seeing a lot of red oak seedlings. So maybe you could dialogue a little bit how to create good cover and cover for areas of bedding or loafing or things of that nature that may be beneficial to somebody, particularly in a forest stand. And let's assume we're going from a mature forest. It's 100 acres. It's mature forest. We're going to create some patchwork, some openness. What do maybe some of those areas look like? And should I create 10 of them? Should they be 1 acre, 5 acres, 10 acres, maybe 100 acres, right? That's a lot of cutting. So how much can you manage? So a big question here, but habitat suitability to benefit the deer for a particular purpose. And again, creating the objective to a goal. I think that's where people struggle. How do I do this?
Yeah. Well, and I'll give the typical biologist answer and say it depends. And again, and that's not kind of like a cop out. That's just because it really does depend on the landscape that you're in and the property that you're on. What I always tell people, there is no cookie cutter approach that works from one property to the next. They may have some characteristics that are similar, and what you do in one place may not necessarily work on another place. And that's what, I kind of hear from landowners like, oh, well, hey, I thought I should try this. And that's really where, in my opinion, and especially I go back to some of the readings like Aldo Leopold as an example, he did a lot of kind of experimentation on his property, trying different things like, hey, I'm going to take and make an acre opening. Is that enough? Well, again, it depends a little bit on the landscape around you, your property. If you're saying 100 acres just solid timber, then I would argue you do want to open that up and probably would need more than just 1 acre. You could have could be upwards of maybe 10 acres or more of that, depending on other aspects around that property. So that's where private lands biologists can provide some really in-depth knowledge, as well as consultants, to kind of that process of what makes the most sense given those areas. And so I guess kind of to back up a little bit and kind of go back to your point there of like that assessment. You mentioned red oaks and they're obviously very preferred in your area and you don't see a lot of those seedlings. Well, part of that is probably, like you said, you have pressure on them, obviously thinking about the biology of these species. What do deer need at different stages of life? And I think that's the other aspect is you're kind of thinking about your property. Think about it from a 365 approach. And what I mean by that is managing deer is not just the fall hunting season. It's truly a 365-day approach. You're thinking about what do they need at various stages. So obviously we're going to fall. Mass production from oaks is key in forested systems. Obviously, in more ag-dominated systems, we have a lot of crops in the landscape. So maybe crops and that food source is not my limiting factor, but it's more cover. So we'll kind of stick with the forested example, as you mentioned. In that case, we obviously want to have and manage for those preferred oak species, as you noted, and red oaks, white oaks, etc., to benefit the deer population in that area. Now, we then eventually can't say, okay, well, that's all they're going to need for just the entire fall. They're going to continue to forage on browse. That's obviously, we think about cool season plantings, food plots as an example of that, putting things in like clover, and doing, radishes, things like that. We actually, as a quick aside, we actually have a habitat post coming out today. It's going to be talking about cool season plantings, with our lab. And so my reason I say some of that is to start thinking about the needs within the season. And then again, mast is there for a short period of time. Once that mast is going, what else are they going to be browsing on? And so they're going to be browsing on any type of vegetation that's available, your any legumes that are there still, any other types of grass or other forbs that are in your on your property. And that's the key of managing it in a way where you're actually opening up that forest floor to get that on the ground. If you just have, I've been to so many places, especially in the north woods of Pennsylvania, where it just is literally a dominant overstory, and you got a lot of bracken fern in the understory. And that's obviously not what you're wanting, because there's not a lot of forage there. And so the way I always tell people is, when you're in those areas, would you want to live in those areas if you were a deer? Well, probably not, because there's not a lot of food in there for you. So you're going to try to move to other areas where you can find reliable food sources. But as we begin to take and open up that canopy, then we start seeing this diversity, as you noted at the beginning of the discussion here, of you getting more forbs, you're getting some grasses, you're getting legumes that are growing up in there that deer can use as forage, but then they can also use some of that as cover in the landscape, and then that's combined with your mast. And then you continue on through into the spring and then the summer months. The requirements are constantly changing, and that's the thing we have to kind of constantly think about, is that 365 approach. So I think there's a lot of ways you can kind of go into this and kind of talking about a rapid habitat assessment, but that's kind of where I start, is you kind of start with that, aerial map, start looking at identifying some of those core things that you're potentially, limiting factors for you, and then starting to design prescriptions that can help that. The question about how big and a lot of that's going to be very dependent, obviously, on your property, how many acres. But I would argue with consultation with private landowner or private lands biologists and consultants, that's where you can design, like, my property really needs like 10 acres of this, or 5 acres of this. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. I think for people to sit there and kind of evaluate what they lack and what they want to change. Now, Sure. You've done studies on this particular topic, and I want to go really specific here for a second. Sure. You've evaluated vegetation types and deer preferences around this. You've done a lot of studying around this. There's been articles that you've written and published, et cetera. So when it comes to evaluating on open landscapes, and open landscapes like agricultural settings, some are old field, some are starting to, senesce, and they're turning into young forest, or maybe even more climatic forest in some cases, depending on the timelines. What have you found consistently on those properties in maybe ag-dominated regions, that a vegetation type or a habitat preference that deer kind of congregate in? And I'm talking about not necessarily food, but maybe more cover. And what type of cover would be ideal in those scenarios? And if you could classify it as maybe a vegetation, types of vegetation, tree species specifically, or plant species specifically, or types of habitat that are relevant to that question. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, what can I do? Well, one, look at what your soil and your related plants are. Sure. Understanding the evenness or unevenness of that, and the richness or the species diversity in those areas globally. And then start to dialogue specifically of actions you need to take to represent what would be quote unquote valued in your area. And so the reason I ask this question is, people are like, well, I think I heard that I don't like climatic forests. Okay. So what do you like and why? Or what did the deer like, right? Because some of it's your own preference and your biases around that. But you've studied this stuff a little more than most. So maybe you could dialogue a little bit about maybe evaluating a particular preference and when deer use what and why. Something along that topic.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I will just kind of preface it by saying I am by no means an expert on all things deer preferences. I would turn folks to really look at some of the other outlets like Craig Harper and Bronson Strickland have done a lot of work in that realm, and they've documented a lot of this. And I think those are really good individuals, as well as Marcus Lashley. But the work that I have done and kind of looking at where these deer, most of my stuff has kind of been more at a macro scale, so kind of looking at land cover types and where they're spending time, as opposed to maybe directly looking at the plant species that they're necessarily selecting on a day-to-day basis. I would argue, though, that when you think about that property, if so, we'll go back to that 100-acre forested area, and we'll use that, and I'll transition into an ag here in a second. But within that specifically, do you have things like in out here in Nebraska? We're thinking a lot about some of our forbs and grasses. So specifically, we'll say blue stem is one of those grasses that's pretty common out here, and we're trying to manage for blue stem on the landscape. Thinking about some other forbs that that you may want to implement management. One of the things, I guess, let me back up before I get into that. One thing I hear a lot is that, well, do I need to plant a lot of these things? And it's like, well, in a lot of cases, and especially in a forested system, and I would argue here really in our ag system as well, a lot of that is in the seed bank. And so you're not necessarily having to do a lot of, I got to take and go buy a bag of stuff and dump it out there. You can actually do management in a way by opening up that overstory that those native forbs and grasses and legumes are already in that seed bank. And so they're going to take and come out as you begin to open up and get sunlight on the floor. So I guess I wanted to make sure I kind of preface that by just saying that it's not that you have to go buy a bunch of stuff and put it in there. You can just be doing some simple management techniques, and a lot of that's already going to be in that area. I would say, as you're kind of thinking, like I said, we're thinking about blue stem, that's giving us some structure. You can think about some of our different forbs that we have in the landscape. So I think about, there are, you have Lespedeze out there, but there obviously have challenge with cereal Lespedeze. That's an invasive one that really becomes problematic. And I use that just as an example because I know that people sometimes you can get really focused on some of these things, and then it turns into, well, that's a non-native that is causing more problems for you. But not to get a little sidetracked on that too much. But the point is that once you start doing some type of management for those species, so blue stem is a good illustration of that. You don't really have to, that seed in most cases is going to be there. You can obviously buy blue stem seed, and for example, or Indian grass, switchgrass, things like that provide that visual structure. But then you get down to like clovers and some of your brassicas and things like that for especially in the cool season you can be planting. But a lot of that stuff when the deer are selecting for, it's because they're looking for that high protein source. Particularly those things like your clovers, they have a high protein content in there. And many of our native plants out there do have high protein in them at different stages of growth. And so especially that early stage in the spring, and that's why being able to manage, if you're managing for like say an old field, you want to take and use practices like prescribed fire to set that succession back. And as you're doing that, that new flush of vegetation is going to come out. And in a lot of cases, you'll see wildlife like deer and turkeys will flock to those areas because they have good protein sources in that early stage of growth. And then as time goes along and things to nest and that protein levels crude protein begins to decline, then other things need to be flourishing. So whenever I tell people about if they're planting something, if they choose to plant something, think about ways to have multiple species of mixes where you're not just one thing. So you're creating kind of this heterogeneity, as you mentioned about before. So I think to your point, there's a lot of ways, a lot of different plants that we could get into, but it kind of depends on the part of the country you're in and kind of where you're at. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, kind of getting.
No, I think it does. I think it's finding a variety of plants and trying to assess, what its value is and benefit to your ultimate goal. For example, I was just working on a client. We're redesigning the shrubland area. Sure. And so I set a threshold of how much cover that I want in the shrubland area. Sure. I've looked at the scale of his property and said, okay, we've got 6 acres dedicated to shrubland. A lot of areas around here in New York, upstate New York, they're abandoned agriculture.
Oh.
And then I go out to Ohio. I work in Ohio quite a bit recently, and there are abandoned agriculture areas. However, the areas that are prior open that they're choosing not to farm are just chock full with non-native plants. So they're like, they're almost unable to access those areas. And so they've got like limitations. And in fact, the vegetation's created fragmentation, essentially limiting their ability to access those areas. So in this shrubland area, for example, one of the recommendation was I gave them 6 or 7 species to focus on, and I'll just chokeberry's one of them, chokecherry's the other one, gray dogwood. I want American hazelnut, elderberry kind of in some of those wetter areas, hawthorn in those wettering areas, and ninebark. Those are the species that I recommended. So people are probably writing those down. Don't write them down. That was for a specific client. But beyond that, the creation of this patchwork of construction of shrubbery, like I oriented them a certain way. I'm actually going to have exclusion cages put in to promote hybrid poplars. We're going to try to create some tree stand locations on the edge. So we're going to fence those off so the deer can't. So you're getting kind of intimate with the landscape. And to your point that you were just making earlier, you can be intimate with 1 plant or 5 plants or 20 plants.
Sure.
More is better. And then assessing what that plant is actually doing for you, what the ultimate goal is, because I really feel like in my area, we are not shrubland dominated.
Yeah.
We are more ag dominated, and it's a clear line between ag and forest. And being forest dominated for some of these properties that I'm working on, you're really just handling open patchwork plus young forests plus more climatic forests. And if you can have some variation within that landscape, like we're talking about some agriculture or food plots, I'll group them together and balancing, the volume of biomass and related quality in that particular food plot or in an adjacent area. And you're saying, okay, well, I'm actually measuring biomass this week in my food plot, or I'm measuring the species diversity, or looking at the indices. I think Mark Thomas, I was listening to him on a podcast one time. That guy is a smart guy. I don't know if you've ever interacted with him, but he's a smart guy. He works. I've been trying to get a hold of him. Mark Thomas, please. Come on this podcast. But he was talking about the indices that he looks at and how he evaluates indices when he's looking at the interspersion and juxtaposition of designing these properties. And that's the same thing I do. And he articulated it so clearly. And I probably won't do him any justice, but he's actually measuring, the within the margins and counting up, between this patchwork and this age and this demographic of plants, et cetera, what those edges are like, so to speak, and putting some value associated with them and not only counting, but numbering and valuing. And I'm saying to myself, that's kind of what I've been doing over the past several years. And I think it's just another way to look at your landscape design and say, okay, what's good, what's great, what's exceptional, what's marginal, what's unsatisfactory to you. And I think those are some things that I'm taking away from this discussion. Like, what is good, what is great, what is the scoring, so to speak. So I got a question. I was going to something.
Okay. Yep.
In your world, in the ag world, for example, and I know you do prairie strips, you're doing a lot of layout, you're working in the field. When it comes to creating cover in ag dominated settings, what is good? What means, what is good to you? Like, and it could be specific to a landscape design that you recently, helped a client on. Maybe to dialogue a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the big challenges that we have out here is eastern red cedar invasion. And so really, if you have a property that is dominant, has a dominant stand of eastern red cedar, really that's not going to be preferable to deer. They may use it in winter for some basically some cover from the basically kind of as a thermal cover and kind of shielding from the cold wind out here. But that's obviously not desirable. And so kind of to transition from that, and I want to note that just because I know that in the Midwest as a whole, red cedar is a big challenge for a lot of landowners out there. And so one of the things that typically we think about with food and cover out here as you mentioned before, and you talked about this as kind of like this idea, even with this interspersion and juxtaposition. And I like the use of that. We actually measure some of that when we do some of our land cover analyses for wildlife, because we want to kind of know, like, are there certain kind of arrangements of cover that are best for wildlife? Again, it all depends on the landscape and things like that. But I say that with the idea of we have this prairie strip project. It's a good illustration. One of the challenges that we've seen in obviously predominant ag landscapes, you have basically it's the opposite challenge you have in a forested landscape, in the sense where you don't have a lot of cover. So your limiting factor out here for most people is a lack of cover. So prairie strips are just one option that producers or landowners can actually implement on their farms or their properties. And it really, a lot of what we actually have rolled these out across our 5 research and extension centers here in Nebraska. Actually, our 5th one will be planned this coming fall. But what we're doing is we're working in collaboration with Pheasants Forever, Game and Parks, and the rest of Game and Parks out here, and NRCS to help custom design mixes that incorporate things like, I'll just throw out a few things. Like you have, blue stem in there, Indian grass, you got partridge pea, you have goldenrod, sunflowers, etc. Part of that is to create that diversity in there. But then what we do is we have like kind of an average diversity mix and then a high diversity mix is kind of part of our little experiment we're doing to kind of see what, to kind of help producer, landowner see, here's kind of an entry level to get some cover on your property. And then here's kind of a high-end level if you want to go to maybe the Cadillac version, if you want to call it that. And really, putting them in, the main reason, like I said, is to help them address declining wildlife populations. So what we see a lot in these areas, and I'll use, birds, for example. Producers regularly I talk with, remember when back in the 60s and 70s, they could go out in the cornfield and they could harvest a limit of pheasants. Well, today they can't really in many cases do that. Well, why is that? Well, because we're managing for very little weed competition now than as we were before. And we have and it's not that we're managing to benefit weeds or anything like that in the past. It was that we didn't have the herbicides that you could apply back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that they have today. So most of your fields are going to look like, you'll have a crop, so corn, and then it's basically bare ground in most cases underneath that canopy of the corn so that you can reduce that competition. Well, most wildlife species, don't spend a lot of time out there. Obviously, deer will utilize it throughout the summer, but they're going to end up, again, they're edge species, so they're going to be within a certain distance of that cover that they can jump out of the corn and get back into, say, some of the forested patches you have out here, or some other type of obstruction, partly because they want to get to other forage. Corn is not the only forage they're going to rely on, obviously, and so that's just a component that they can use. They really want to be pursuing those forbs that are out there, those perennial and annual forbs that they have in the landscape, and that's kind of speaking to that food resource. But that's where these prairie strips are it's a tool where you're basically taking in our predominant corn and soybean system and putting in about 10% of those fields in perennial vegetation strips. And some of the benefits, and we're working on a grant right now with Iowa State in that project, and that's basically to showcase ways you can implement them here to landowners. And we just had a field day just a couple days ago. We actually had about 75 people came out and we got to talk through some of the things about soil health, cover crops. Part of it was tied to prairie strips, part about some other cover crops that people could implement. But a lot of it was built around how do I improve my soil? How do I address water runoff? Because you see that a lot, especially in ag systems. You get these fields that get a lot of erosion. So how a producer says, how do I mitigate that? And then back to the declining wildlife, hey, I want to hear more quail. I want to hear more pheasants. I want to have more turkeys out there. I want to have more deer. What can I do? Well, that's a tool. It's not the only tool. It's a tool. And it's a pretty simple one. And then obviously through FSA and NRCS, they can help administer those type of programs for landowners. And one of the things I had a biologist mention this the other day, which I thought was really a great point. Those strips can act as basically a corridor amongst other patches that you have in the landscape. And so thinking back to that forested system that you mentioned at the beginning, creating that, we don't have to have these perfectly shaped, kind of this block as this nice square, field. It can be irregular, whatever works for you. And again, it all comes back to your land objectives that you have. And so the strips are nice because it's a nice linear path, but you can actually have them, they can basically range from 30 to 120 feet within a corn and soybean field, and they actually can be irregular depending on the resource concern. So there's probably places where you want to have them could be 60, 90 feet wide with the intent to maybe stop erosion coming down, that water running down that hill. And so, and I guess I'll kind of wrap up with this and just say one of the things I see and hear a lot, especially with annual versus perennial, particularly perennial plants, prairie plants, is the first year or two, people say, boy, that's a weedy mess out there. Why don't we spray that or do some things to help that along? Well, a lot of it's because those plants are establishing a large root base. So we're talking like, we'll give a comparison, corn, maybe a foot, maybe, foot and a half or so root depth. Whereas these prairie plants can go upwards of 6 to 8 feet and deep into the soil with their root mass. So they're establishing a massive root mass in those early couple of years. And then as that water's coming down the hill, for example, that can hit that and then it can start dispersing off. And what Iowa State's actually shown is they've seen upwards of a 20 times increase in soil retention by just putting those perennial vegetation strips in. So that's a limiting factor out here is cover, to your point. And so putting them in, and I remember actually a farm manager, I was talking to him, this was last year, and he said, there's already deer bedding in those strips you guys put out there. And so right there is an illustration. They're coming out, there's food there, but then there's cover right there and that they can get to. They don't have to walk a ways away. And I think that's part of that conversation is in these ag landscapes, how far away is that cover adjacent to their food? And that's the point of this kind of diversity. You don't have to have all these kind of perfect shapes and things like that.
Yeah, I think this is a great, and you've dialogued a lot. I think people need to re-listen to that portion of what you just explained.
Sure.
And interesting enough, right, you're designing agricultural settings to be more beneficial for the wildlife. And these strips, their implementation, and we're not seeing a lot of that out here in the Northeast, but in some of the designs that I'm starting to work with clients on, we're starting to add that attribute to it. These strips become great corridors. They connect, they create great connections amongst the property. It's interesting because in some of the areas today, agriculture is not dominated, the pocket, but like the payment per acre is not what it used to be in some of the areas, right? And so a lot of people in the Northeast specifically, they don't worry too much about the per acre pay. And so they're willing to let some of these areas convert into old field, et cetera. This is a great example of somebody that could, I guess, if you're looking at a CRP program or something like that, you can implement these prairie strips and major benefit to your wildlife. And it's just a simple practice that, would benefit your deer. You mentioned pheasants. In our area, it could be rough grouse, but other species that are on the landscape that are ground nesters or et cetera, that like to utilize some of those grassland settings more appropriately. So I would say that I think it's a great practice and something that's completely overlooked from the flow and movement of animals. That's the same thing with agroforestry, which you and I talked about last year.
Oh yeah.
That's a huge aspect of design, and considering again, these open grounds, you're trying to improve their utilization. These are just simple practices you can do to just amplify interest, and it's pretty simple to do. All right, we're at the end of this. We're getting towards the end of this. So I want you to leave something with the listeners. They're going to be sitting in their tree stands pretty soon, as are you, and you'll be bow hunting. And so what's something they're going to be sitting in the tree stand? Let's give somebody a takeaway. Let's start sitting in your tree stand. Let's look at limiting factors or non-native plants, something that you think somebody could do, or say, okay, what's a takeaway from this podcast and from your perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, we could go on for a while about some of these things, but yeah, I would say one of the biggest takeaways is coming back and looking at your property and identifying what is that missing piece of the puzzle. Because I think it's easy to kind of say, get overwhelmed and say, okay, well, I can't do 10 different things. I want to start. So that's why I always say, start small and kind of figure out what you can do. Everybody, may be able to afford different things. And some of these things, that's one of the nice advantages of having practices where, like, say, you're going out and you got your chainsaw in the wintertime, you can say, sitting there deer stand and say, well, hey, I think we should take and open up this area over here. And let's start there. Let's just take and find that, 1 acre block and just start opening that up. So we're able to take and cut some trees down, create some openings there, where you can have a forester come out and they can help you identify, what areas you want to maybe target more strategically, say if you have a larger property. And I would say that's where you start, is what are the limiting factors as you're sitting there in your deer stand and listening and thinking, okay, what am I missing? What are the deer like? Because I've hunted properties, for example, before where I kind of envision them, they're like ephemeral properties, and that basically it's the deer just pass through. Outside of the rut, you don't ever see deer there. Well, why is that? Well, because there's a limiting factor. And one of them, when I hunted in Georgia, it was because there was literally no or very little understory in there. So it was that you could see directly through that, could be 200-300 yards, and a deer doesn't have really much of incentive. Besides, when they would come in there, it was during basically, early October, when they would start dropping acorns in some of those areas. You'd see them then. And then obviously when the bucks were running through there chasing does and kind of out and about running around in the rut, that's it. But then once you got past that, rut period, you never see the deer again because they moved off to the neighbors. Well, I regularly hear from people say, well, I want the deer to be on my property. I don't want them always on my neighbor's property. And so obviously, building, kind of thinking about the cooperative idea, and kind of, you can work with your neighbors, but if you're thinking about your property, what is that missing piece? And that, in that case, in that property was, we just had no understory. Now that was a property I was just had got permission to hunt, and the landowner told me they didn't really have any interest in really managing for that, because that was not really an objective for them. But I was just happy to honestly hunt there. So I guess that would be one of the biggest takeaways, is just what are those limiting factors? And then two, as you're thinking about, okay, what's the next step now? Is it something I can do, or do I need to reach out and get some consultation? One of the things I hear a lot is that, people say, well, I don't know where to really get started. You can simply find a local consultant, a private lands biologist, whoever. I've gotten questions myself, Purdue landowners are asking, what is a good, mix of food plots I should be putting in here? And so just start reaching out, finding some other people you can chat with and start having conversations. And then honestly, the thing I always argue is, as you start testing these things out on your property, chat with your neighbors, chat with others around you, because that's really where change is going to come into play. As you start finding others that are like, hey, so you tested this out and it worked this way, and maybe this didn't work as well. Those learned experiences, I think it's Aldo Leopold put it in his one of his famous quotes, that basically that conservation, it takes time, essentially. And I think it's that unfolding that relationship with the land, that we live in a society that is very instantaneous, and we want these things by tomorrow. And so my wife can attest, I'm probably one of the most impatient people out there. I want this immediately. I don't want to wait around. But, that's the thing with conservation. It takes time. And those prairie strips are a good illustration of that. We have people the first year saying, well, those things look like a weedy mess. What are we going to do? Well, one thing we did do is we actually, in our strips that we showed the other day, we actually had a lot of foxtail in them. So we came through and we mowed them down. And so that helped, obviously. And then this year, it's like amazing to see the flourish, how all the native plants coming out of there, blue stem and the partridge pea and all these other native plants are just coming out of that, out of those grassy areas that we were, again, weedy last year. But next year is going to be amazing to see that beautiful prairie emerging from that. But that's 3 years, and that's like, well, I don't want to wait 3 years. Well, fortunately, some of that stuff just takes time. So hopefully that makes sense. Just kind of a couple nuggets for people to take away.
No, those are great nuggets. Hey, I'm going to just ask you one last question here at the end. And
Sure.
You mentioned, it takes time to get here. You've made some other remarks around building relationships with people, reaching out to people to get advice, et cetera, this
Sure.
associated education around this topic. these prairie strips, the maintenance, and it makes me think some work that I did recently on a client property. I had issues with switchgrass and I had to get rid of the crabgrass related. Actually, I have the exact same issue here in my own property. And what is one of the objectives to eventually burn those areas or burn those strips, or how are you going to maintain those? I think people would be interested in that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so that's so this project started off as a 100% extension project. And so what that means is it's kind of like initial, we're setting this up, kind of doing some test things. And then the intent is to get some additional funding to actually do exactly what you mentioned, is to do some type of burning, haying potentially. A conversation a landowner asked the other day, they said, well, hey, can you graze these with cattle? And one of the things I would argue is within that contract. So what we're doing, if people go out and they enroll in, say, the program with Prairie Strips CP43, and so if you enroll in that, obviously FSA has rules and regulations of what you can and can't do. So obviously you need to consult with those individuals first. But I believe from what they said was on the grazing, they would allow up to 60 days of grazing on those prairie strips. And so that's a whole other question of like,
awesome.
how does that play into it? Again, a lot of this comes back to setting that succession back, because what's going to happen is if we do nothing with those prairie strips in the long term, the vegetation is going to get so thick in there, because especially the grasses take over like crazy, and they will dominate that. And so they're going to get to a point where I like to say they become almost like a biological desert to some level, because stuff can't get into them. So like, for example, a turkey couldn't take her poults through there because it gets so thick at some point, which again is why they do mid-contract management with those CRP programs to set succession back, because eventually you're going to start getting tree encroachment in some of those areas. If you have trees nearby, that's going to obviously cause additional problems. So to answer your question, yeah, there's going to be some additional research to actually explore some of those things like fire and haying and grazing and stuff like that.
All right. Well, I want to give you a shout out for something else, right? You have a podcast out there, Wild Ag, right? And so we want to push that in the lab. You're on Instagram. I follow you. So maybe just dialogue quickly about that.
Yep. So yeah, we have a podcast called Wild Ag, and the idea is really built out of bringing conservation professionals and landowners together. And so talking about some of these topics like, conservation and ag landscapes, how do I do this? And so we bring on different guests from landowners to conservation professionals to talk about a variety of topics. We just launched it back in May. Been very successful. We actually have one coming up here on Monday. It's going to be released, tied to the land ethic and Aldo Leopold. It's actually the 75th anniversary of the Sand County Almanac. So that'll be dropping out on Monday. And then our lab, the awesome lab, Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X. We put out posts every Wednesday about various projects we're doing in our lab. And then the last Friday of every month, so in this case today, we're actually going to be releasing a habitat management focused post. So
awesome. All right. Well, I appreciate you being on the podcast, and I've been following you for a while, and I we'll be in touch. I'd love to have you on this again.
Absolutely.
And we'll chat more and make sure everyone, reaches out, take a look at the public, the podcast information that's out there. I think it's quite helpful. I've listened to your podcast, and I appreciate the information that you guys provide. So I want to thank you, and we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Really appreciate the invite.
All right. See ya.